Silence is a predator in high society packs, where visible weakness guarantees a death sentence. Nobody dared acknowledge a broken prince, terrified of an Alpha King's wrath. But one quiet girl, armed with a silver tray and unwavering empathy, broke unspoken rules, raising her hands to speak. Everything shattered afterward. Sadie Gallagher adjusted the stiff, suffocating collar of her uniform, doing her best to blend into the opulent background of the Wyatt Estate ballroom. She wasn't pack elite. In fact, she barely registered on the werewolf hierarchy at all. As a low-ranking Omega who had left her birth pack years ago to live among humans, Sadie was currently working as a senior server for Magnolia and Vine Catering, a highly sought-after private firm based out of downtown Seattle. Tonight, they had been contracted for the annual Autumn Solstice Gala of the Cascade Ridge Pack, the most ruthless and wealthy werewolf syndicate on the West Coast. The ballroom was a sea of designer gowns, bespoke tuxedos, and dangerous predators masquerading as corporate socialites. At the center of the room stood Alpha King Alistair Wyatt, a massive, terrifying man whose iron-fisted rule had expanded the pack's wealth through aggressive real estate acquisitions and offshore holding companies. He was currently laughing heartily with a group of politicians, humans who had no idea they were drinking scotch with a man who could tear their throats out in a fraction of a second. Sadie wove through the crowd, expertly balancing a tray of champagne flutes. As she moved, her sharp senses picked up the subtle, aggressive pheromones of the elite wolves. They were asserting dominance over one another with every handshake and forced smile. But Sadie's attention was drawn away from the center of the room to the dark, shadowed alcove near the massive oak doors. There stood John Wyatt. John was the Alpha King's eldest son, but you would never know it by looking at the way the pack treated him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and strikingly handsome, with dark hair that fell messily over piercing, intelligent amber eyes. Yet he stood completely alone, radiating a quiet, profound isolation. John was mute. In the brutal, perfectionist culture of the Cascade Ridge Pack, a physical defect in an alpha bloodline was considered a curse, a weakness that invited challenges from rival packs. King Alistair, deeply ashamed of his son's inability to speak, command, or roar, had effectively erased John from the pack's future. Instead, the king had named his ruthless nephew, Brandon Croft, as the heir apparent. Sadie watched in quiet horror as a group of young, high-ranking wolves, led by a vicious socialite named Cassandra Hale, intentionally bumped into John. Cassandra's stiletto heel caught John's polished shoe, and she spilled a drop of red wine on his tuxedo jacket. "Oh, watch where you're standing, ghost," Cassandra sneered, not bothering to lower her voice. The wolves around her snickered. John didn't flinch. He didn't growl. He simply took a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at the stain, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He was completely ignored by the security detail, ignored by his father, and treated as living furniture by his peers. But Sadie noticed something else. As John lowered his hands, his fingers twitched in quick, precise movements against his thigh. Idiots. Pointless, hollow idiots. Sadie stopped dead in her tracks. He was signing. It was American Sign Language, muttered under his breath, or rather, under his fingers, as a self-soothing mechanism. Sadie knew ASL fluently. Her late father, a human who had known nothing of her mother's werewolf nature, had been profoundly deaf. She had spent her entire childhood communicating with her hands. Seeing this powerful, supposedly broken werewolf using the secret language of her childhood sent a jolt of electricity down her spine. Without overthinking the severe danger of stepping out of her place, Sadie altered her path. She bypassed a group of wealthy investors from Goldman Sachs and approached the shadowed alcove. The air around John was freezing, tinged with the scent of pine, old books, and deep, suppressed sorrow. She stopped in front of him and offered the silver tray. John didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, expecting her to quickly pass by or, worse, mock him like the others. Sadie shifted the tray to her left hand. With her right hand, she formed a series of smooth, practiced gestures. "They are fools," she signed, her movements crisp and clear. "The champagne is a little warm, but it helps tolerate the company. Would you like a glass?" John froze. The stillness that overtook his massive frame was so absolute, it was terrifying. Slowly he lifted his head. His amber eyes locked onto Sadie's face, wide with absolute shock. For a terrifying second, Sadie thought she had made a fatal mistake. Interacting with the disgraced prince was social suicide, and doing so in a language he used to hide from the world might be seen as an insult. John looked around, scanning the room to see if anyone was watching them. The pack was too busy fawning over Brandon Croft near the ice sculpture to care about the dark corner. John's hands raised slowly. His fingers trembled slightly before forming the shapes. "You can see me?" he signed back. The gesture was small, kept close to his chest. Sadie gave a soft, reassuring smile and signed, "I see you. I also saw you call Cassandra Hale an idiot. For the record, I completely agree." A microscopic smirk tugged at the corner of John's mouth, a ghost of a smile that transformed his entire face, making Sadie's breath hitch. He reached out and took a glass of champagne from her tray. Their fingers brushed, and a sharp, electric spark snapped between their skin. Both of them gasped softly, pulling back. The scent of rain-washed earth and blooming night jasmine suddenly flooded John's senses. It was Sadie's scent, unmasked by the catering uniform. The mate bond. Before either could process the monumental shift in their reality, a heavy hand slammed onto John's shoulder. "Well, look at this," a sneering voice echoed. It was Brandon Croft. The heir apparent was flanked by two burly enforcers. "The mute is trying to hit on the hired help. Careful, sweetheart," Brandon said, looking Sadie up and down with predatory disgust. "He might try to bark at you, or whine. That's about all he's good for." Sadie's blood boiled. She lowered her eyes, playing the submissive human server, but John stepped slightly in front of her, his massive frame shielding her from Brandon's view. John didn't growl, but the sheer, oppressive weight of his alpha aura, an aura he supposedly didn't possess, flared for a fraction of a second, causing the champagne in the nearby glasses to ripple. Brandon took a half step back, suddenly looking unnerved, though he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Pathetic," Brandon spat, turning on his heel. "Get back to the kitchen, girl." Sadie bowed her head and backed away, but not before casting one last glance at John. "Later," John signed discreetly against his leg. "The greenhouse. Midnight." The Wyatt Estates greenhouse was a sprawling, Victorian-style glass structure located a quarter-mile from the main house, beyond the manicured topiary gardens. By midnight, the autumn chill had settled over the King County hills, and the thick glass panes were fogged with condensation. Sadie slipped through the wrought-iron doors, having ditched her catering apron. The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of exotic orchids and damp earth. John was already there, pacing like a caged predator. The tuxedo jacket was gone, his sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms scarred with faint, silver lines, the undeniable marks of wolfsbane burns. When he saw her, he stopped. He didn't hesitate. His hands moved rapidly, the signs flowing with desperate, pent-up energy. "You shouldn't have come. It's not safe for you here. Brandon noticed you." Sadie stepped closer, completely unafraid of the hulking werewolf. "I couldn't just leave. What was that spark, John? Back in the ballroom?" John closed his eyes, his chest heaving. He raised his hands, his expression agonizingly vulnerable. "You are my mate. The moon goddess paired an invisible prince with a catering server. It's dangerous. My father would kill you just to ensure I have no attachments to leverage." Sadie's heart hammered against her ribs. Mate. The sacred unbreakable bond of their kind. She had read about it, dreamed about it, but experiencing the gravitational pull of him was entirely different. "If you are an Alpha's son, why do you let them treat you like dirt?" Sadie signed, her brow furrowed. "Why do you hide your aura? You terrified Brandon for a second back there. You aren't weak." John turned away, running a hand through his dark hair. He walked over to a potting bench and pulled a small, locked mahogany box from beneath a sack of fertilizer. He opened it and produced a thick medical file. He handed it to Sadie. She opened the file. It was a clandestine medical report from Virginia Mason Medical Center in Seattle, dated 15 years ago, issued under a John Doe alias. She scanned the human medical jargon. Vocal cord paralysis, severe neurological degradation. Toxicology report indicates heavy, prolonged exposure to localized botulinum toxin and concentrated Aconitum napellus, wolfsbane. Sadie gasped, looking up at him. "You were poisoned?" she whispered aloud, forgetting to sign. John nodded grimly. He raised his hands. "I wasn't born mute. When I was 8 years old, my mother died in a suspicious car crash on Interstate 90. The local news called it a tragic accident. The pack called it an ambush by rogues, but it was a hit." Sadie watched his hands fly, the tragic history unfolding before her eyes. "My mother was investigating financial embezzlement within Wyatt Industries. King Alistair's new mistress, who is now Queen Beatrice, Brandon's mother, wanted her gone to ensure Brandon would inherit the empire. The night my mother died, Beatrice gave me a cup of warm milk to help me sleep. It was laced with a synthetic neurotoxin and liquid silver." Sadie covered her mouth. "Goddess, your vocal cords." "Burned from the inside out," John signed, his amber eyes flashing with long-suppressed rage. "The human doctors saved my life, but the damage to my larynx was permanent. My wolf cannot heal it, because Beatrice has never stopped poisoning me. Every day, the kitchen staff, loyal to her, slips microdoses of silver nitrate into my meals. It suppresses my alpha aura. It keeps me weak. It keeps me silent." Sadie felt a surge of violent protectiveness. This wasn't just pack politics. This was a hostage situation. John was a prisoner in his own home, surrounded by people who were slowly killing him to prop up a false heir. "Why haven't you left?" Sadie signed furiously. "You could leave the estate, run away." "Because of my sister," John signed back softly. "She is only 12. Beatrice threatened to arrange an accident for her if I ever challenged Brandon or tried to leave. So, I play the broken ghost. I let them kick me. I took online classes at Gallaudet University under a fake name to learn how to communicate, plotting in the dark, waiting for an opportunity." John took a step closer, towering over her, yet looking at her as if she were the only light in his world. "I was going to burn this pack to the ground from the inside, but now you are here. My mate. You are a vulnerability I didn't plan for, Sadie. You need to quit Magnolia and Vine tomorrow and leave Washington." Sadie stared at the scarred, beautiful man before her. She thought of her father, marginalized by society because of his deafness, and how she had spent her life advocating for him. She looked at John, a true Alpha King in waiting, chained by silence and silver. She reached out, gently wrapping her warm, small hands around his large, scarred ones. She pulled his hands down, effectively stopping his frantic signing. She looked him dead in the eyes and stepped into his personal space, letting her own muted omega scent wrap around him in a comforting embrace. She released his hands and signed with absolute, fierce determination. I am not leaving. I work in the catering industry, John. I know how to handle food, and I know how to bypass kitchen security. Starting tomorrow, Queen Beatrice is no longer in charge of your diet. We are going to flush the silver from your system. We are going to wake up your wolf. John stared at her, the shock evident in the rigid posture of his shoulders. It's treason. If we are caught, Brandon will tear you apart. Let him try, Sadie signed, a dark, rebellious smirk crossing her face. He doesn't know I exist. I'm just the invisible hired help, and you're just the invisible mute son. They won't see us coming until it's too late. Before John could respond, the heavy glass door of the greenhouse rattled. A flashlight beam swept across the foggy glass. Check the perimeter, a gruff voice barked. Brandon said he saw someone slip out back. Make sure the mute isn't causing trouble. John's eyes widened. In a flash of terrifying speed, a glimpse of the true alpha buried beneath the poison. He grabbed Sadie by the waist and pulled her behind a dense cluster of towering monstera plants, pressing her back against the cool brick wall. He leaned his heavy body against hers to shield her completely from view. Sadie's breath hitched as his chest pressed flush against hers. She could feel his heart hammering, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the hunt. John looked down at her in the dark, his amber eyes practically glowing in the shadows, silently promising that he would rip the throat out of anyone who tried to touch her. As the guard's boots crunched on the gravel outside the door, Sadie reached up and traced a single word onto the center of John's chest with her index finger. Fight. John closed his eyes, and for the first time in 15 years, a deep, rumbling vibration echoed in his chest. It wasn't a word. It was a growl, and it was just the beginning. The flashlight beam swept past the frosted glass of the greenhouse, illuminating the heavy condensation, but failing to pierce the dense foliage where John and Sadie stood, breathless. The gravel crunched as the guards moved on, their voices fading into the damp Seattle night. John slowly stepped back, the fierce, protective heat of his chest leaving Sadie suddenly cold. He looked down at her, his hands moving with a fluid, urgent grace. That was too close. You cannot stay here, Sadie. My father's enforcers ask questions later. If they find you associating with me, they'll assume you're a spy for a rival syndicate. Sadie shook her head stubbornly. I told you I'm not running, but we need a strategy. She paced the narrow aisle between the orchids, her mind racing. I work for Magnolia and Vine, but your stepmother's head chef, Henri, mentioned tonight that the estate is looking for a permanent dietary aide. I have a degree in culinary nutrition from the University of Washington. I can get that job. John frowned, signing back sharply. Henry is loyal to Beatrice. He's the one who mixes the silver nitrate into my protein shakes and soups. If you work under him, you'll be in the crosshairs. Exactly, Sadie signed, a triumphant spark in her eyes. Keep your friends close, and your poisoners closer. If I'm preparing the dietary trays, I can swap your meals. I can introduce activated charcoal and bentonite clay into your diet to bind the heavy metals and flush the silver out of your system. Once the silver is gone, your wolf's natural regenerative abilities will kick in. Your larynx will finally heal. John stared at her, utterly floored by her bravery. This tiny, low-ranking Omega was casually plotting to overthrow the biochemical suppression of an Alpha King's heir. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing against her cheek. The mate bond hummed between them, a warm, golden thread of absolute trust. You are risking your life for a ghost, he signed softly. Sadie leaned into his touch. You're not a ghost, John. You're the Alpha. It's time they meet him. 2 days later, Sadie Gallagher officially joined the Wyatt Estate staff. Armed with a pristine resume and a humble, submissive demeanor, She easily bypassed Chef Henry's suspicions. Henry was an arrogant man who preferred shouting orders to actually inspecting the meticulous plating of the restricted diets. This gave Sadie the perfect blind spot. For the first week, she carefully intercepted John's breakfast trays. Instead of the silver-laced oatmeal, she swapped in oats infused with detoxifying herbs she secretly purchased from a specialized apothecary near Pike Place Market. She replaced his contaminated water pitchers with pure, alkaline water mixed with microscopic doses of liquid gold, a holistic werewolf remedy known to neutralize wolfsbane. The effects were not immediate, but they were profound. By the third week, the pale, sickly pallor that had clung to John for 15 years began to vanish. The faint, silver veins that pulsed under his skin when he was exhausted faded into nothingness. His posture, usually slouched to feign submission, naturally straightened, adding another terrifying inch to his already massive frame. They continued to meet in the greenhouse at midnight. These stolen hours became their sanctuary. Surrounded by blooming night jasmine, John taught Sadie the deeper, more nuanced signs of his own making, while Sadie updated him on the pack's political movements. One rainy Tuesday night, John was waiting for her, pacing with an energy that seemed to crackle in the humid air. When Sadie slipped through the door, he didn't wait. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, pulling her into his arms. "My wolf!" he signed frantically against her shoulder, his hands trembling with raw adrenaline. "I can hear him. For the first time since I was a child. He's awake, Sadie. He's furious." Sadie beamed, tears pricking her eyes. She reached up, framing his handsome face. "I can feel it. Your aura. It's leaking out, John. You have to be careful. If Beatrice notices..." Before she could finish the sign, John captured her lips with his. The kiss was a collision of 15 years of starved isolation and the explosive, undeniable claim of a mate. It was desperate, bruising, and deeply tender all at once. Sadie gasped into his mouth, her hands gripping the thick lapels of his flannel shirt as a wave of pure, dominant alpha energy washed over her, making her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, John rested his forehead against hers. He took a deep, shuddering breath. For a terrifying, miraculous second, Sadie heard a faint, gravelly rasp escape his throat. It wasn't a word, but it was sound. The vocal cords were knitting themselves back together. But their triumph was violently interrupted the following afternoon. Sadie was in the kitchens, carefully pouring a fresh, clean bone broth into John's specialized thermos when the heavy stainless steel doors banged open. Queen Beatrice strode in, her sharp, predatory eyes scanning the room. She was flanked by Brandon, who looked unusually smug. "Chef Henry," Beatrice barked, ignoring Sadie entirely. "The Blood Moon Ascension is in 3 days at the Snoqualmie Falls Reserve. Brandon will officially be named the heir. We need the menu finalized." Henry scrambled out of his office, bowing his head. "Of course, my queen. Everything is on schedule." Beatrice's eyes narrowed as she looked toward the dietary prep station where Sadie stood frozen. "And what of my stepson's supplements?" He looked entirely too alert at the board meeting this morning. He actually made eye contact with a stakeholder from J.P. Morgan. It was unnerving. Brandon sneered, leaning against the counter. "The freak is probably just hopped up on caffeine, but we can't have him acting unpredictable at my ascension. Up the dosage, Henry. I want him practically comatose by Friday." Henry wiped his brow. "My queen. If I triple the silver nitrate, it could cause total organ failure. It might kill him." Beatrice's smile was utterly devoid of warmth. "Then it will be a tragic, sudden illness. The pack will mourn the loss of their broken prince, and my son will take the reins without any lingering shadows." "See to it, Henry." Sadie kept her eyes glued to the cutting board, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They were going to kill him, The slow poisoning was over. Beatrice was moving in for the kill. As soon as the royals left, Sadie slipped out the back service door. She didn't wait for midnight. She sprinted through the manicured gardens, her mind screaming. She had to find John. The game had just changed, and time had officially run out. The Snoqualmie Falls Reserve thrummed with the energy of the Cascade Ridge Pack. Torches cast long, flickering shadows against ancient Douglas firs, as the blood moon bathed the cliffside in a crimson glow. Sadie stood rigidly near the catering tents, her heart pounding against her ribs. At the precipice stood King Alistair, flanked by a smug Queen Beatrice and Brandon. Beside them, John looked dreadful. He played his part perfectly, slumping his broad shoulders and bowing his head to mimic the physical decay of the heavy silver dose Beatrice thought he had consumed over the last 3 days. King Alistair raised his arms, his voice booming over the roaring falls. Tonight, under the blood moon, we secure our legacy. My nephew, Brandon Croft, possesses the ruthless strength my own bloodline lacks. He is your new alpha heir. The disrespect hung heavy in the damp air. Beatrice stepped forward, holding an ornate silver goblet out to John. Sadie's sharp eyes caught the oily sheen of aconitum and liquid silver swirling in the dark wine. It was an execution disguised as a toast. "Drink, stepson," Beatrice purred, her eyes gleaming with malice. "To the new era." "Drink it, freak," Brandon hissed, stepping into John's space. "Or I'll pour it down your throat myself." John slowly reached out, his large hand wrapped around the stem of the goblet. Beatrice's triumphant smile widened. Then John lifted his head. His amber eyes were no longer dull. They blazed like twin suns. John didn't drink. Instead, his fingers clamped down, crushing the thick metal goblet as if it were foil. The poisoned wine exploded across Beatrice's designer gown. She shrieked, stumbling backward. But John wasn't finished. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath of the damp air, and finally stopped holding back. He dropped his aura. A suffocating, localized pressure slammed into the clearing. The sheer, unadulterated weight of a pure-blood Alpha King drove the front row of wolves to their knees. Brandon collapsed, gasping for air, his own aura completely obliterated. Even King Alistair staggered, his eyes wide with uncomprehending horror. John stood perfectly straight, the scarred, silent ghost replaced by a terrifying god of war. John looked down at Beatrice, his throat working as muscles that hadn't been used in over a decade shifted. 15 years. The voice was rough, like gravel grinding during an earthquake, but it echoed clearly over the roaring waterfall. The entire pack gasped. The mute prince had spoken. 15 years of silver, John rasped, his voice gaining strength. He turned his blazing eyes to his father. "Poisoned by your wife to steal my birthright." "Lies!" Brandon choked out from the mud. "I have proof!" The crowd parted as Sadie marched into the center of the clearing, holding up a manila envelope and a digital recorder. She threw the files at King Alistair's feet. Medical records from Virginia Mason, detailing chronic botulinum and silver poisoning. And a confession. She pressed play. Chef Henry's panicked voice echoed from the speaker. "If I triple the silver nitrate, it could cause total organ failure." Beatrice ordered it. King Alistair stared at the evidence, the color draining from his face as he looked at his treacherous wife. "Beatrice," he growled. John stepped forward, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "No, I am the Alpha now. Beatrice, Brandon, exile. If you are on my territory by sunrise, I will hunt you myself." The enforcers immediately dragged the screaming queen and her terrified son away from the cliffs. Silence fell over the reserve. John turned his back on his father and walked through the kneeling pack. The sea of predators parted in absolute reverence. He stopped in front of Sadie. The oppressive aura vanished, replaced by the warm scent of rain and night jasmine. He reached out, framing her face with his large hands. "You saw me," John whispered, his rough voice beautiful and steady. "When I was nothing." Sadie smiled through her tears. "I saw a king." John leaned down, capturing her lips under the blood moon, claiming his Luna and his throne in one breath. The invisible air was a ghost no more. Silence can be a prison built by those who fear your potential, but it is never a permanent sentence. Sadie and John proved that true power isn't always the loudest voice. Sometimes it's the quiet resilience to survive the dark. Through unwavering empathy, they shattered a toxic legacy, proving love is the ultimate antidote.